I'd like to welcome you to today's session of Speaker's Corner. Now, a number of you are here for the first time, so just to give you a bit of background and context, Speaker's Corner was conceived as a format, a fresh air experience to offer Calgarians an opportunity to exchange points of view on topics of interest. We've had the program's been running for about 3 years now. We've had some fantastic debates with some really excellent speakers. In any event, today we have a very interesting and relevant topic for you today. And the resolution is, be it resolved that the burning of coal be phased out of Alberta for environmental and economic reasons. We have two very knowledgeable speakers.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm pretty excited to have this opportunity. I do think it's fair for me to declare all my conflicts of interest. I have no, I'm actually a volunteer. I have received no funds for any of the work that I've done on behalf of the coal phase-out campaign. I act as a member for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and neither myself nor the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment has received any monies in relation to a company that works on the electricity system here in Alberta, either directly or indirectly through a third party. Go team. I personally have some investments in renewable energy, solar, turbines, those kind of things. I'm happy to share that with you if you think that's a concern. None of those companies are directly invested or indirectly invested in Alberta's electricity system. So I'm excited to be able to present the case that the coal phase in Alberta is important, timely, and achievable. The official statement being debated is, and not chosen by me, but by Ms. Stirling here, be it resolved that Alberta should phase out the use of coal to save lives and millions of dollars. Phasing out coal will definitely save lives, but will cost us some money to achieve. You can't get something for nothing. More on that later. But what I will be arguing instead, if I have the privilege of altering things a little bit, is that the public health benefits and carbon emission saves is worth the time, money, and effort for Albertans to achieve. First, some statistics. In 2014, coal provided 67% of the grid electricity here in Alberta. That was up from 63% in 2013. But because the absolute amount of electricity has been used has gone up from year to year, the absolute increase from 2013 to 2014 was 13%. The Alberta burns more coal than all the rest of Canada combined, and each one of you, know it or not, burns about 40 pounds of coal per day for your electricity use. The power comes from 18 generators, 12 of which are located about 50 kilometers directly upwind from Edmonton. They range in age from 46 years of age to 4 years of age. In 2013, the federal government enacted legislation capping the age of the plants to 50 years. There's some major irony here. Is the utility's own documents in the past list the economic and engineering age of the plants at around 40 years. So in effect, by limiting the age to 50 years, they're expanding it by 10 years in total. However, it is important to note that the rationale for that decrease or that limitation of life to 50 years by the federal government, by the Harper federal government, was that it would save lives and decrease carbon emissions, for both public health and climate reasons. So under the new legislation, the 2012 legislation, 4 will close in 2019, and a large number through the years up to 2029, leaving a smattering to close up until the year 2061. So that'll be the last, under the current legislation, the last plant will close in 2061. That'll be Keep Hills 3. So 2061, I'll be 92. My 7-year-old daughter will be 52. And I just don't think that's good enough. So why is burning coal bad for our health? Well, coal essentially is compressed organic matter, like trees, that have been treated for millions of years in tons of pressure until it forms a solid burnable stone. But it's far from pure carbon. When it burns, it creates a variety of toxic substances. Mercury, 44% of Alberta's mercury comes from coal, mercury in the air. Sulfur dioxide, 33% of our SO2 comes from coal. And then the nitrous oxide, 10% of Alberta's NOx comes from coal. And then a variety of other chemicals such as lead, cadmium, benzenes, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and arsenic. And I want to make a special mention of an air pollutant called particulate matter 2.5. I know Ms. Stirling is going to be speaking on this. So first, a little bit of science. So PM 2.5 essentially means substances small enough to enter your lungs and then cross over the lung blood barrier so that those particles are distributed throughout your body. That's what PM 2.5 means. So they come from a variety of sources. Benign sources such as dusty roads, construction, farming, sea salt from ocean spray, and heck, even pollen. Certain pollens, because of their size, qualify PM 2.5. It also comes from combustion, the most visible being like the diesel fumes that come out of the back of a truck, or smoke from a forest fire, or PM 2.5 from coal combustion. Now, there's a qualitative difference between running through a dust cloud from the road and running through coal fumes. And coal produces 6% of Alberta's industrial PM 2.5. Forgive me while I switch. So why is this important? Two reasons. The science behind PM 2.5's effects on health is the strongest. So when you actually look at the science on air pollution's effects on health, the science on PM 2.5 is powerful. It's being implicated in a variety of disease entities such as heart attacks, strokes, asthma exacerbations, lung cancer, and childhood autism. But the most concerning thing, it has been associated with mortality, both short-term spikes, so a bad air day, and long-term exposure, so the grinding amount of PM 2.5 you're exposed to annually, have been shown to increase mortality. And mortality just means people dying earlier than they should be. Recently, Alberta Environment was mandated to release a report as the PM 2.5 in the capital airshed, which essentially means Edmonton, has exceeded the Canada-wide standards. So the Canada-wide standards are calculated at 30 micrograms per meter cubed for the 5% worst days of the year over a 3-year period. And so this triggered a level 4 response. In those reports, which I'm happy to share with you from Alberta Environment, these events are explicitly stated not to be due to forest fires, but instead are winter events. They occur on inversion days when the warm air overlies the cold air, trapping the pollutants. And they primarily consist of 2 substances, ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate. So when you burn PM 2.5, the little bits that come out of the smoke, out of the whatever you're burning, that's called primary 2.5. These chemicals are called secondary PM 2.5 because basically the sulfate molecules in the air, the sulfur dioxide molecules in the air, and the nitrous oxide components in the air combine with ammonium, which is primarily from agriculture, and they form these secondary compounds. So in the capital airshed, in that area, 60% of the sulfur dioxide and 40% of the nitrous oxide, approximately, give or take 2 or 3%, are which are the 2 main precursors of this secondary PM 2.5. Sorry for getting technical here. Those 2 components, 60% and 40%, come from coal-fired power. And that's also in the scientific report. So this year, that report suggested an interesting thought experiment to us. If Ontario has phased out its coal power and our use is increasing, and we know that Edmonton have a PM 2.5 problem, what if we compared Toronto's PM 2.5s to Toronto's PM 2.5? Remembering that Toronto is a city 5 times the size of Edmonton. And what we found was that Toronto's PM 2.5, over the last 10 years, as they phased out coal-fired power, dropped substantially. And Edmonton's have actually worsened, to the point that Edmonton now has worse air quality than Toronto. And we, as a province, have no plan to deal with this. In 2005, at the start of Ontario's coal phase-out, at the very beginning, Ontario declared 53 smog alert days. And the last coal plant closed in April of 2014. And that year, how many smog days, alert days did they have? 0. And in Toronto's, the a Toronto Medical Officer Health report on air quality in 2014 attributed a substantial amount of that improvement to the phase-out of coal-fired power in Ontario and closure of coal-fired power plants south of the border in the United States. So for the first time in over 20 years, 0 smog alert days. So in 2013, the Pembina Institute, the Asthma Society of Canada, and the Lung Association of Alberta and Northwest Territories, along with the organization that I'm a member of, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, published a report called A Costly Diagnosis, Subsidizing Coal Power with Alberta's Health. It took a validated model that was created by the Canadian Medical Association, and it was actually created to quantify the effects of the Ontario problem, and they took that model and they applied it to the Alberta context, adjusting for population densities and location of the plants. The results, estimates of annual deaths of about 100 a year, 80 hospital admissions, 700 hospital visits, so emergency visits, and 4,800 asthma days. And that's a day missed from school or work due to an exacerbation of asthma. This only accounted for 2 pollutants, that PM 2.5 that I talked about earlier, and ozone. And ozone is created for precursors that we previously talked about. It doesn't include the mercury-related effects on neurological development in children, and it doesn't count the other cancers that we talked about and other chronic illnesses. So if anything, things are much worse than what that report describes. So in order to confirm that result, they took a second model, and this one's from Harper's Environment Canada, so from the federal government's own organization, Environment Canada. When they did the proposal to limit the coal-fired power plants to 50 years, they developed a second model looking at the effects of coal-fired power on health. And if anything, the results of that secondary analysis were more powerful than the ICAP analysis. So now we have 2 different models looking at this. The public health effects are bad enough, but let's take a moment to consider the climate crisis. I realize this event is not explicitly a debate on the climate crisis, but considering I'm sitting across from the most vocal and well-funded climate crisis denier in Canada, I think it's worth mentioning. She will suggest that as this is not an issue to society, the cost of coal's carbon dioxide doesn't need to factor into the equation. Mrs. Stirling's organization, the Friends of Science, would believe that you have no need for concern. And a good number of you may ascribe to that theory, Leo and friends. But it's important to know who does ascribe to this belief that the climate crisis threatens our species' existence on the planet. 99.5% of the climate literature in 2013 and 2014 said that anthropomorphic climate change was a cause of global warming. NASA, the President of the United States, 3 of them 4 main English-speaking prime minister candidates have said that this is something that's very important to them. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, the United Nations, the Pentagon, and such conservative stalwarts as the International Energy Agency and the Pope. We can add the Dalai Lama to that list recently as well. So granted, it could be a total conspiracy between all of those public organizations and leaders, but look around. Tornadoes in Calgary, drought and fires throughout the western provinces, increasingly severe hailstorms, the Slave Lake fire of 2013. Just last week, they announced that July was the hottest month ever. Not the hottest July ever, but the hottest month ever on the history of the planet. You don't have to be a climate scientist to know that we have a serious problem. And this, right now, we're stated to be at 0.87 degrees Celsius above the average planetary mean, and we're headed for 4 to 5 degrees. And even in the best case scenario, we're hoping to limit it to 2 degrees. We have a serious existential problem. So, coal produces 35% of the industrial carbon dioxide in Alberta, pretty much the same as all the oil sands combined, but with none of the jobs or royalties associated with the oil sands. 5 of the top 7 carbon emitters in Alberta are coal plants. It is politically ripe for carbon reductions. So let's go back to the health effects for a moment. Using that ICAP model, they actually did some financial analysis to see what the impact of this was on the province of Alberta. So just looking at strictly the health effects, it was determined to be 0.7 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Adding the social cost of carbon, which has been variably calculated to be anywhere from 3 cents a kilowatt hour, at the minimum up to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, that brings us to a minimum, and with using our pool price, which has been on average around 6.6 cents a kilowatt hour, that brings us to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So even though you're not paying for those costs on your electricity bill, society pays for that as a whole. Ms. Stirling will argue that this is only a model from a non-peer-reviewed report like her own. The difference between this model has literally thousands of peer-reviewed articles as its references by thousands of scientists. Studies like the amazing Harvard Six Cities study, or Pope's, not the Pope, but a gentleman called Pope, seminal Utah Valley study. The 2004 American Heart Association statement on air pollution and cardiovascular health has 194 references. The 2010 American Heart Association statement on PM2.5 and cardiovascular, specifically PM2.5 and cardiovascular health, has 426 references. Those are peer-reviewed references, I like to point out. The science is strong. If you're interested in actually seeing the studies for the basis of all this, a lot of those are on links to our website. I encourage you to go there, or I can share those with you later. So what we're proposing is an accelerated coal phase-out over 15 years, with the last coal plant closing in 2030. This would mean that the 4 oldest coal plants close immediately, and we're kind of lucky right now because we actually have excess generation at the moment thanks to this new Shepherd plant, which went in the southeast Calgary. And then we close a plant a year through 2027, and those last 2 plants would close in the last years of the next decade. So can it be done? Well, Ontario has already accomplished it. About the same amount of absolute generation gone in 10 years, with the last plant closing in 2014. So other jurisdictions have similar proposals. The UK, through a tripartisan agreement, is going to close 2,100 megawatts of its coal by 2030. We have about 6,000 for the record. And a third of the UK plants will close by the end of 2016. Denmark and Los Angeles have plans to eliminate all coal-fired power by 2025. Now, we've all heard about the Obama Clean Energy Plan. So this is being done around the world. So what to replace it with? I think the natural assumption is natural gas. Supposedly a cleaner fuel, and we still get to play with fire. So there's some big concerns about natural gas generation. The first off is it remains a fossil fuel. And these plants have about 30-year lifespans, 30 to 35. There's a very real possibility that as the climate crisis worsens, these plants will become stranded assets. And as the rest of the world moves away towards renewables, we'll be left behind. But an even greater risk is that methane is also a high-potency greenhouse gas, about 80 times the amount for carbon dioxide over a short 20-year time span. So what that means is not only do we have to worry about when we burn it, the combustion of carbon dioxide, but if there's any leaks in the system, anywhere from where the drilling occurs to transportation of that fuel to storage of that fuel, if there's any leaks above 3% of the entire system, that negates the climate benefits of natural gas and actually makes it about equivalent to coal. Now, we don't really know the amount of those fugitive emissions. There have been variable assessments, anywhere from 0.9% to 9%, so a huge range. It's very hard to quantify, but it's important to recognize that anything over 3%, if that's occurring, negates its value. So if not natural gas, then what? Well, the first, easiest, and cheapest is energy efficiency. Less energy use means less money spent by consumers on electricity. It's a win-win for everybody. There's really no political loss there. And studies have shown returns on investment for energy efficiency of $4 on the dollar spent. We have the honor of being the only jurisdiction in North America without an energy efficiency plan. So we propose decreases of 10, 15, and 20% over the time span of 2020, 2025, and 2030. So leading up to 20% by 2030. Seem radical? Well, Arizona has a 22% target over the 9 years leading to 2019. Massachusetts mandates 2.6 annual reductions moving forward from 2015. And multiple states have annual targets of around 1% per year. So energy efficiency alone could account for removing a large number of coal-fired power plants off the grid. We're also the only province in Canada without a renewable energy plan, despite having the best solar and wind resources in the country. Currently, 10% of our electricity derives from renewables. So we're suggesting doubling it to 20% by 2020, 30% by 2025, and 40% by 2030. Does that sound incredible? Well, Germany currently sits at 32.5% and is proposing 45% by 2025. California currently sits at 26% and proposes 33% by 2020. If you want to get a little closer to home, Nova Scotia, traditionally a coal-fired burning province, proposes 40% by 2020. Currently sits at 22% and proposing 40% by 2020 in 5 years, a full decade earlier than we're suggesting. And now back to that money part I mentioned at the beginning. These investments won't come for free. There'll be costs associated with improving our health and safeguarding our future. And we'll have to determine what we're willing to pay. But there are also costs to the status quo. What are the costs to continuing to act the way we have? What's the value of a life saved? What's the value of an intact, safe climate? This isn't going to be funded by government and tax dollars, but by private institutions, citizens, and cooperatives. People are going to make money during the transition. And it likely won't be ruinous to the average consumer as solar and wind prices plummet as the technology improves. I personally, and I'm sure many would, be willing to pay an extra 2 cents a kilowatt hour to protect my children's future. And we can put in plans in place to support those that are needy. And really, isn't that what it's all about? Protecting the present by decreasing coal's health effects, and protecting the future by mitigating our carbon footprint. My kids deserve no less. Don't yours?
Thank you very much. On the note about the climate crisis, I just want to bring to your attention that in the year 1134, extreme drought hit the north of France. In June, a hot wind dried Normandy. Everywhere, thirsty people flowed into streams and rivers, and many drowned. In September, in Normandy and elsewhere, many towns and villages were completely destroyed by fire, like Le Mans, Chartres, Alençon, Nogent, and Verneuil. The country underwent a drying of the Sambre and Namur. Tsunamis hit the coast of the North Sea in September and October, and one night the sea invaded the land to a depth of 7 miles, stunning villages and homes. The disaster affected Flanders and neighboring countries. In December, major floods in Normandy, and floods reached the roofs of houses. So that's from 1134, and I have 14,000 more of those extreme weather events that happened between 1 AD and 1999, or sorry, 1990. So it's just to point out that the apparent climate crisis we face now is nothing new. So in response to Dr. Vipond's presentation, first of all, thank you for debating this. Thank you for being here. The starting point of the debate is, be it resolved that Alberta should phase out coal to save lives and millions of dollars. I oppose this resolution on several grounds. Will phasing out coal save lives and millions of dollars? Well, let's ask 3 burning questions. 1, does the use of coal-fired power present a small or a significant health risk in Alberta? 2, if coal were replaced, what is the cost and what are the consequences? And 3, are carbon dioxide emissions from coal use or human industry so significant that they're causing climate change, or is that effect nominal? Are natural forces more influential? So, number one, does the use of coal present a small or significant health risk to Albertans? First of all, why do we use coal anyway in Alberta? Well, simply put, we have lots of it. It's a high-quality coal and easy to mine because it's very near the surface. By contrast, we do not have large hydropower like Ontario, Quebec, and BC. We have no nuclear facilities like Ontario. We have coal. Since the fundamental premise of Dr. Vipond's argument is about health, let's first look at how important affordable, reliable power is to the healthcare system. In a detailed peer-reviewed study in the UK, electricity was recognized by the UK Department of Health as the most vital of all infrastructure services because without it, nothing else will function. If you go into any modern hospital or diagnostic clinic, every procedure requires reliable, affordable power. According to AltaLink, Alberta hospitals use 1,875,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per month. That's enough to power 3,000 houses. In fact, if you look at human health and longevity records, you will find that Albertans only lived to about 50 years old in the 1920s. But with the advent of coal-fired power plants in Alberta, people now live well into their 80s, most of them in very good health and able to have advanced medical care like knee and hip transplants, heart surgery, complex cancer treatments, and we have excellent world-class facilities. Now, Dr. Vipond had mentioned that Toronto's air was worse than Alberta's. I invite people after to go over and look at the chart that I brought, which is from the yourenvironment.ca, showing a comparison of Toronto and Alberta air, Edmonton, Alberta air, and how the emissions have diminished since the 1970s. And you'll find that actually we're doing much better than Toronto. Now, I mentioned the issue of healthcare because Alberta Health Services already takes up about half of the provincial budget. So it's a system near the tipping point. Power prices are a small but critical part of the healthcare budget. Coal-fired power is very reliable, and coal is the most affordable source of power of all, and we have a long-term, reliable supply here. So we don't have to import it from anywhere. But here's the burning question. Does the use of coal cause health problems? Dr. Vipond and his colleagues argue that fine particulate matter from coal-fired power plants, that's known as soot. The particulate matter from coal-fired plants, or burning any such matter, that's soot, the black part of the smoke that you see in a wildfire or a diesel exhaust. Is it the soot or PM2.5 that causes asthma and significant respiratory conditions in Alberta? Our evidence says no, not in the way that coal is used in Alberta, because we use supercritical power plants here that burn coal at a very high temperature and in a very clean manner in the new plants. And those new plants filter out about 99% of the PM2.5 emissions, and they're very high efficiency. So first of all, in our research, we found that the Pembina Institute report entitled A Costly Diagnosis misrepresented the facts about coal-fired power plant emissions, exaggerating them by 15-fold. Coal-fired power plants emitted only 0.4% of fine particulate matter in 2011 in Alberta, but residential fireplaces emitted double that. But we don't hear anyone calling for the closure of residential fireplaces and wood-burning stoves. Why is that? Secondly, coal-fired power plants are not located province-wide, but asthma and respiratory problems are found province-wide. Our research found that there are double the asthma visits to non-major urban emergency departments, and these are far away from coal-fired power plants. And just to make it clear, that's from peer-reviewed research. It's from real people, statistics on real people. It's not a simulation or a model, as with the Pembina Institute's report. Thirdly, is the volume of fine particulate matter or soot from coal-fired power plants significant? Is it the most significant? No. Wildfires, for instance, emitted about 1,000 times the PM2.5 of coal-fired power plants in Alberta in 2011, and far more toxins, because it's an incomplete burn. When you're burning coal in a modern coal-fired power plant, the coal is burnt at a high temperature. It's pulverized when it goes in there, so the burn is very complete. When you're burning in a forest or in a home residential fireplace, it's not a complete burn, and so you get the PAH, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that Dr. Vipond mentioned. You get numerous different kinds of chemicals in the atmosphere, and these also morph into other kinds of toxic chemicals that you will never get from a coal plant. You can see actually in our report that the wildfires or you can see actually over here on the boards that the wildfires this summer, the ambient air was filled with soot, and sometimes the air quality rating was like 12. That will never happen from coal-fired power plants. So you have to put things in perspective. Fourth, is the research basis of the Pembina Institute's report reliable? Based on our research and in our opinion, no. Their report relies on a simulation, a computer model, 2 computer models. Our research looked at a number of long-term peer-reviewed studies about real people and real hospital visits in Alberta. The Pembina Institute report that Dr. Vipond relies upon uses a computer model that economist Ross McKittrick tested in 2004. McKittrick found that the model predicted that more people died of air pollution than died in total, and he was measuring that against known data. On page 9 of our report, you can see how downtown Edmonton goes from a clear day to a shroud of wildfire smoke from fires in BC in just a few hours, up to 250 micrograms per cubic meter. You literally can't see anything. Another burning question, are there other factors that would cause such health problems? Well, in our research, we found a whole bunch of factors, and many of them are natural. Edmonton seems to suffer more than other places, it's true. But let's look at its claim to fame. Edmonton is the gateway to the north. That means it's a transportation hub. It has the fifth busiest airport in Canada, 2 transcontinental rail lines, dozens of heavy and light diesel truck fleets, and diesel motors emit soot. They emit carbon in the form of diesel emission particles, and these hang in the air, concentrated, fairly near the ground where they're emitted, right near where people breathe. Meanwhile, coal-fired power plants are about an hour's drive outside of Edmonton. They use modern scrubber technology, and their emissions are nominal compared to the transportation sector. And you can check that on Environment Canada and see that transportation is one of the major emitters of PM 2.5. Edmonton has other problems. It's on the edge of the boreal forest. It's surrounded by farmland. And in terms of landscape, there's lots of sloughs, rivers, and lakes. These create humidity in the air that traps these different particulate matters at ground level. And it's also surrounded by agricultural land, meaning there's lots of natural sources of asthma and respiratory triggers like seasonal spores, mold, pollen, and agricultural dust. As well, Edmonton has the bad luck to be trapped under weather inversions and dirty ridges, both in winter and in summer. One more thing that affects the entire province during the growing season, and that's the fact that ammonia fertilizer can transform into highly mobile PM 2.5 aerosols. And we found the most even match geographically between the PM 2.5 province-wide between agricultural cultivation and fertilizer use. So in summary to the first question, does the use of coal cause significant health problems? Our findings say no. The second burning question we must answer, if coal were to be replaced, what is the cost and what are the consequences? Alberta's power is generated by a number of sources. I'll be using numbers from our report because that's my point of reference. So they're a bit different. You'll notice there's a difference between what I say and what Dr. Vipond said. In 2013, 52% came from coal, 38% from natural gas, 3% from hydro, 4% from wind, 3% from biogas and biomass, and 1% from other. The way the power grid works in simple terms is that you need a constant base load of permanent minimum supply on the grid 24/7. So when you come home and you turn on your lights, voila, there's light. There's no interruption for you between your demand and the electricity grid's delivery of power, because the Alberta Electrical System Operator has researched use and demand and makes sure that there's sufficient power available. To have that base load constant, you need to use the most affordable and reliable power, and we have lots of coal here. It's inexpensive overall, and it makes the backbone of the power grid. The people who want to phase out coal want to do that in a decade or 15 years. To replace the 2013 figure of 52% coal generation with the somewhat cleaner natural gas, we would need to build about 8 new natural gas plants. They cost $1.4 billion. That would cost $11 billion and more to replace coal with natural gas. Plus, taxpayers would have to pay compensation to the coal industry, because these people already have a deal with the federal government about phasing out their industrial operations. On top of those costs, we should remember right now that natural gas input costs are double those of coal. So that means the market price would probably double for power, and natural gas is a market commodity, so it's subject to very wild fluctuations in price. Some activists claim that Ontario did it in 10 years, we can too, but they forget Ontario has massive hydro and nuclear resources for power. You know, it's got Niagara Falls, it's right next door to Quebec, they've got tons of hydro. We don't have that, but Ontario has no coal. That was something they had to bring in. Also, Ontario hospitals now, they faced a 27% price spike in power prices in 2012 to 2013. So they phase out coal, now they have to cut services. How does that help the healthcare case? Part of the Pembina Institute's claim is that renewables like wind and solar could replace coal-fired power plants. First of all, wind and solar are not dispatchable power. You can't turn them off and on. They rely on Mother Nature. Secondly, wind and solar are the most expensive forms of power generation. There's a chart, I don't know if I actually brought that chart. There's a chart on the U.S. Energy Institute, the U.S. EIA, that shows that the ratio of renewable power watts per capita in Europe goes up, and you can see that Denmark and Germany have the most renewables and the highest prices, and those prices are 3 times that of the U.S. So thirdly, you need equivalent backup power at the ready for when wind and solar surge online or drop off. We don't have suitable hydro resources for that, so we would have to build these natural gas peaking power plants. Peaking means, like, you know, when you turn on the gas at home, you get sudden energy and you can turn it up or down very quickly. That's what a natural gas peaking power plant does for the system, for the grid. So if you have the wind blowing and you've got tons of wind coming, then drops off, your grid will go to blackout, and this can cause like a whole massive blackout throughout the system if it's not tempered properly. Now, the ASO has made very significant efforts to integrate wind so that won't happen, but also these peaking plants are required so the power can be zooped up right away to bridge that gap. And what happens when you do that, of course, not only is the plant expensive, but it's also the most efficient and wasteful way of burning natural gas, and you end up getting actually almost the same amount of emissions if you burn coal. And fourth, there are many hidden costs piled on the consumer in wind and solar. Right now, you are all paying about $2 billion for the transmission lines installed to serve the wind farms in the south. That's a figure from Evan Barry at IPSA, which is the Independent Power Producers Society of Alberta, and also the $11 billion figure I said earlier, that's also from him. So we only get 4% of our power from those wind farms, but we paid $2 billion just for the transmission lines, and we are paying it. So, we only get wind power when the wind blows. So how is that cost effective? So the cost of replacing coal would be astronomical, and there would be other consequences as well. Presently, industry uses about 75% of Alberta's power. If you look at Ontario, the UK, and the EU, where power prices are rising dramatically due to the addition of wind and solar, you find that the major industries are either moving offshore or they're demanding subsidies for their power. So governments, of course, want to keep business active, so they say, okay, we'll pay you a subsidy and we'll get it from the taxpayer. So this is another hidden hit that people get. And finally, the worst thing that's happened, and you see it a lot in Europe and especially in the UK, is heat or eat poverty for consumers. In the UK and the EU, there are millions of people who now live in heat or eat poverty. They have to choose, should I heat my house or should I buy food? Many people close off part of their house or apartment and keep their activity just in one room to save money on heating. And due to this, there's been a rise in premature deaths, particularly in the vulnerable and poor population, because actually it's cold that kills. It's not coal. Professor John Hills did a study in the UK, and he found, from a health and well-being perspective, living at low temperatures as a result of fuel poverty is likely to be a significant contributor, not just to the excess winter deaths that occur each year, which is a total of 27,000 over the last decade in England and Wales, but to a much larger number of incidents of ill health and more demands on the National Health Service, plus a wider range of problems of social isolation and poor outcomes for young people. So in summary to our second question regarding costs and consequences of phasing out coal, we find it would cost at least $11 billion to move to natural gas, that wind and solar cannot replace coal and are the most expensive forms of power, that industry and jobs are negatively affected by power price rise, and that consumers would be pushed into heat or eat poverty, creating even more health problems and premature deaths. And finally, our third question. Are carbon dioxide emissions from coal use or human industry so significant that they are causing climate change? Or is that effect nominal? Are natural forces more influential? Now, some people may not know that there have been many historic warm and cool periods in human history. We've experienced global warming for the past 100 years or so, partly because the Earth was coming out of the Little Ice Age, where temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees colder on average than these days. Before the Little Ice Age, there was the medieval warm period, which was very pleasant and stable weather and climate in Europe, and that's when all the castles and cathedrals were built. But it was devastatingly hot in other places, like the southern US of today. The whole region of California in that time period experienced mega drought epochs, like 100-year patches of drought, then sudden floods, and patches of drought again. So, sound familiar today? Friends of Science Society was started in 2002 by a group of Earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists and engineers. Citizen members joined over the years. The core group has about 300 years of combined knowledge and experience, and their research shows that the sun is more influential on climate than carbon dioxide from human industry. And I'm talking about a literature review. We don't do original research. In 2002, the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta solicited a debate between the PEMNA Institute and Friends of Science Scientific Advisors and an Alberta engineer. Our position then was the same as now. We believe and we know that the sun is the main direct and indirect driver of climate change, not carbon dioxide. Some of you may be aware that the sun has 11-year cycles when the magnetic poles flip. There's also a correlation between high and low sunspot activity with the climate on Earth. There are many changes in the sun, many cycles, but some include the total solar irradiance. It's a small change, but it has an effect. Changes in ultraviolet ray output, changes in the solar wind. All of these affect the climate in various ways, and they are all driven directly or indirectly by the sun and various orbital positions. In June, we had astrophysicist Dr. Nir Shaviv here as our guest speaker. He pointed out that since climate is affected by cosmic forces, you actually need an astrophysicist to explain those things, not a climatologist. And so all these people who are putting out peer-reviewed papers in the climatology world are talking about Earth's atmosphere, but they're not addressing the bigger picture, which is the cosmic influence. And Dr. Shaviv sees carbon dioxide's role in global warming or climate change as nominal. Up until September of 2013, most people were sure that human industrial emissions of carbon dioxide was driving climate change. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report that year stating that there had been a hiatus or stagnation or pause of some 15 years in global warming. That goes back to before the Kyoto Accord, that before it was ratified. So that was the international agreement that was supposed to cut greenhouse gas emissions and reduce warming. Well, warming reduced itself naturally, and we believe that's partly due to the solar cycles. Judith Curry, professor of atmospheric scientists of Georgia Tech in the United States, testified to the US Senate that carbon dioxide is not the knob on climate variability. So why are people saying this? Well, carbon dioxide has gone up dramatically, but temperatures have not. So Alberta's carbon emissions are dwarfed by those of the developing world. We have a report on our website by Robert Lyman. He is an energy economist of 37 years experience, and he shows that cutting our carbon emissions to meet proposed G7 targets would destroy the Canadian economy. But at the same time, developing nations could continue to emit greenhouse gases, and they could do so in the most polluting way, which we don't do in Alberta, and with no regard to the stringent air quality environmental standards we have here in Alberta and Canada, where since the 1970s, pollution has steadily dropped. Ross McKittrick spoke at our annual luncheon in 2013, and he explained that the social costs of carbon, or the way that carbon taxes are calculated, are calibrated to computer climate model forecasts, simulations, that are far, far above the real temperatures, and therefore the social costs of carbon are greatly exaggerated. They're greatly exaggerated. Not to mention that the social benefits of using fossil fuels are never accounted for. Finally, many solar scientists are forecasting a cooling period, perhaps like the Little Ice Age. If so, we would need all the fossil fuels we can get. In summary, global warming has stagnated now for 18 years and 6 months, despite a significant rise in carbon dioxide. The sun is now going into a sleepy phase of low sunspot activity, which is similar to what happened in historic cooling periods. And shutting coal-fired power plants to please the world would simply destroy our economy while others continue to emit in the most polluting way. So in fact, there would be no environmental, economic, or health benefit, especially if we go into a little ice age of cooling. We say at Friends of Science, be it resolved that Alberta continue to benefit through modern hospital and diagnostic services, prosperous industry, and warm, well-lit homes and streets, thanks to the affordable, reliable power of coal-fired power plants from our local abundant supply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
I want to first point out the things that I agree with, if I may. I agree that I hope, along with Ms. Stirling, that climate change isn't real. I hope to God I'm wrong, because it's really scary. Like, be right, please, on this, because if you're wrong, we're hooped. So I'm totally in agreement with her on that. I hope she's right. I also agree with her that natural gas is not the solution. She's already said that there's air pollution associated with that. She says these peaker plants are dangerous and expensive, and I agree with that as well. So let's just start off, I'll just point off those things.
By the way, you're confined to 3 to 5 minutes, if that's all right?
That's fine, I don't have a lot.
Thank you, okay.
So she points out that we have lots of coal, so we should burn it. I feel like saying we have a lot of cyanide lying around, so we should use it. It's really important to note that we have the best solar and wind resources in Canada here. So if we have a lot of solar and wind, let's use it too if we're going to use the same arguments. I also don't have any agreement with her that electricity is important. In no way am I suggesting we shut down the electricity grid or that we should, transfer into plasma energy or some strange non-electrical thing. I think we should continue to use electricity. I just think we should generate it in healthy means and also cut back if there's ability to cut back without influencing our lifestyle. So I think energy efficiency is really important. She tells us that coal is the most affordable source of energy. Well, it's really exciting to know that wind and solar energy prices are plummeting around the world. They're not quite here yet, but in many jurisdictions around the world, solar actually is beating a coal. And I think if you compared, I'm pretty sure I'm accurate on this, if you compared building a wind power plant today in Alberta versus a new coal-fired power plant in Alberta, you'd find that the wind is at least equivalent, around 7 cents a kilowatt hour. It's actually equivalent to natural gas plants as well. So it's more about incentivizing the right type of generation rather than saying one's more expensive than the other. So Ms. Stirling said a number of times that we use supercritical power plants in Alberta to burn our electricity, and that's true in two cases. Keep Hills 3 and Genesee 3, the two newest plants, are supercritical plants. None of the rest of them are. Battle River 3, which is our oldest, is 46 years old and uses 46-year-old technology. There have been no minimal upgrades to that. And even those new plants, I'll just mention, so I've got the statistics for those new plants. So they're 18% more efficient, which means they burn about 18% less carbon dioxide or give off 18% less carbon dioxide. The NOx from both plants are 0.6 tons per gigawatt hour. And the 2006 standard, they just eke under that of 0.69. The 2011 standard is 0.47, so neither of those plants would pass under the 2011 standard. Every other plant is multiple times worse than that, and I'm happy to show you that information. The sulfur dioxide from that plant, from G3 is 0.9 tons per gigawatt hour. From Keep Hills 3 is 0.7 tons per gigawatt hour. The 2006 standard, they both, well, actually only Keep Hills 3 eke under that at 0.8 tons per gigawatt hour. And the 2010 standard, neither would make at 0.65 tons per gigawatt hour. And the PM 2.5 standard for those plants are, both of the PM 2.5s are 0.95 tons per gigawatt hour, and the 2010 standard is 0.06. So they don't manage to pass the muster on those. And it's important to know those are the two cleanest plants. They're the only two supercritical plants. Everything else is way worse than that. So I got a couple more minutes to just say, so wildfires, I have no dispute with wildfires being bad for health. They do create PM 2.5. They create those bad days where the bad levels go up. We have no control over that, except for with climate change, the wildfire situation seems to be getting worse. But it's important to know that the mortality effects are both short-term and long-term. The short-term effects, most of those are happening in the winter on those inversion days that both of us mentioned. And there's no wildfires in January, as far as I'm aware of. And that the long-term effects, that grinding exposure to PM 2.5, that is separate from the wildfire scenario. She mentioned Ross McKertrick a number of times. So I just think it's worthwhile knowing who he is. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. He's the chairman of the Academic Advisory Council of Lord Lawson's controversial climate-denying charity, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is associated with the Heartland Institute, another very well-known climate-denying institution in the United States. So that modeling paper that she mentioned with McKertrick that says that more people would die than exist on the planet, what they did was then died in total. That is referencing a paper. So what they did is they went back in time. They applied the ICAP model back in time into the 1960s. And so in the 1960s, that's what they came up with. But that's not what the model was developed for. The model was developed for current exposures. And so if you're going to misapply the model, you're going to get some weird data. And so I think one peer-reviewed study by a known climate change denier versus the thousands of peer-reviewed papers out there on air pollution, the balance just isn't there. I have maybe 2 more quick points. She mentions ammonium from farming being the problem of that secondary PM 2.5 generation. It's quite explicitly stated in that Alberta Environment Report that ammonia is not the limiting factor. The limiting factor in that chemical reaction is the sulfur dioxide and the nitrous oxide. So it's important to be aware of that. I want to mention briefly the concept of energy poverty, which she mentioned that the heat, was it heat or eat? Anybody know where that concept came from? Oxfam, maybe, or UNICEF? It's got to be some poverty advocacy organization. Well, it's actually from the PR firm Burson Marsteller, based in New York City. That's the same organization that was involved in trying to limit the damage to cigarette companies from the lung cancer scenario. They were hired by a company called Murray Energy in the United States to develop a response to the concerns about coal in the United States, or around the world, and they came up with this concept of energy poverty. And so you'll be hearing that quoted a lot by anybody who's advocating for the coal companies, including Prime Minister Abbott in Australia, who loves to throw that about. I think I'm about done. Is there anything else? Yeah, so as far as climate's concerned, you can take the Heartland Institute's opinion, you can take the Friends of Science opinion, or you can take 99.5% of the peer-reviewed climate science. The science is so good that if they don't factor in CO2 into your daily weather forecast, they get it wrong. So I hope you're right. I'm worried you're wrong.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, Dr. Vipond said there are the best solar and wind resources here, and that's probably true, but it still costs $1 million a megawatt to integrate wind into the electrical grid, and that's from someone who works at ISO. The reference to heat and eat poverty, I've never heard of that PR agency, but I have read a lot of newspapers and reports, including peer-reviewed studies out of the UK, and they use that term. So maybe a PR firm started it, but it's a reality for people who are living hand to mouth. When Dr. Pizer was here in 2013, he told us that many pensioners go to thrift shops and they buy used paperbacks, like romance novels, to burn in their grill at home, in their fireplace at home, because they don't have money for the regular power. Also, with regard to wildfires, if you look at the Flat Top Fire Complex Review study, which was about the Slave Lake fires, you'll find that most of the 50% of the forests in Alberta are now old growth forests, so they're going to burn. That's what they do. Fire is a natural way of the forest renewing itself. And also with regard to climate change, it's actually not human-caused climate change activities that are causing wildfires. It's human negligence. Usually 60 to 80% of the fires in Alberta are caused by people. And not necessarily arson, but usually negligence. And as for Dr. McKittrick, he is a very fine economist, and he undoubtedly would do an excellent analysis of any simulation. So he was one of the early people who questioned the math on all of the simulations on global warming. And so I think that we can take it for granted that he studied it for a long, long time. And thankfully, he's shown that we aren't facing a climate crisis, even though we do have an effect on climate and pollution. And we should do more and more about fixing that, and less about wasting money on climate change initiatives. Thank you.